Hi there. Can you hear me? If you can hear me, could you just tell me that you can in the chat box? I just want to make sure everything's working. Oh, great. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to get started here in a few minutes, and I might give it a couple extra minutes to see, some more people will show up. But thank you. Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Before we do, just a couple quick notes. We do have a co-host on, Brittany. She can help if there's any kind of technical issues or if you have any kind of non-content related questions. She'll also be posting links. Yep, she already has in the chat box. The webinars are archived, so if you want to go back to this or see what other ones we have there, use that link. If you have any questions related to the content as we go through, feel free to type them in the chat box or to type them in the question and answer box as we go along so you don't forget them. But I won't be able to get to them until the end. All right, and thank you, Brittany, for what you're doing. Okay, so welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5, the discussion. And if you are kind of not quite to the Chapter 5 yet and you're looking forward, you're just kind of, looking forward to kind of see what the requirements are of the Chapter 5, that's great. If you have made it to Chapter 5, congratulations. That's quite a feat. I know that the proposal is a challenge in itself, and then, getting through IRB, collecting the data, and making it to the final chapter is impressive. So you should be happy and proud of yourselves for that. So to Chapter 5. So what we're going to go over today is kind of the typical contents of a social sciences discussion chapter. The contents among schools, the features of the chapter are pretty consistent. Always, obtain a copy of your school's guidelines for all the chapters, because even while there are commonalities and features that are pretty typical, your school may have some, slight differences. So always, use your school's template. You're going to hear me say that several times throughout, because if you're not following your template, that's a very easy and quick reason for your chair or your reviewers to just give the document back to you and say, make it align with the template. So, that's important, obviously. And it's a guide as you go through. Again, ours kind of is general, but it pretty much aligns with school templates that are out there. All right, so this is what we're going to be covering: the interpretation of the chapter, the interpretation section, limitation, implications for practice, recommendations for further research, summary. And again, sometimes these schools will have these sections in different order. They may have them titled slightly different, but the idea is the same. You have your results in Chapter 4. This is going to be the chapter where you discuss your results, what they mean in relation to previous literature, and discuss any kind of implications for research and implications for practice. Okay. So the introduction, pretty brief in this chapter, because you're basically just reorienting your reader, right? Reminding them of what your study is about, refreshing their memory. So it's good to restate the purpose of your study in the introduction and remind the reader of the importance of your study or why the study was needed or the research problem. If you want, you can also preview contents of the chapter, what's the sections that are coming up. Now, some schools are a little different here. I know there's a school, I forget which one it is, that wants you to kind of recap, give brief summaries of the preceding chapters. That's not typical, so I wouldn't worry about it unless you're at the school that says, recap and summarize the preceding chapters. Sometimes also too, somewhere you're going to need to summarize your findings. In other words, that helps the reader. It tells them what the findings were in very plain spoken terms, a summary, right? You don't go into statistics because all that stuff is in Chapter 4. And sometimes you can end the summary, end the introduction by summarizing your findings. Or sometimes the summary of the findings comes in the next section, which is interpretation of the findings. I think unless your template specifies one or the other, I think either place is fine to summarize what you found. And again, this is a plain spoken summary. It's not statistics heavy. And it doesn't go into a lot of details. It's just, here's what I found. All right, so the interpretations of the findings section, sometimes it's also called the discussion section, which I know sounds a little odd, being that it is the discussion chapter, but it's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be discussing your findings, and it's really the center of the chapter. So it's helpful for you as a writer, and it's helpful for your reader if you make subsections within this section. And it's going to help you as a writer to kind of compartmentalize information based on research question or based on theme if it's qualitative. Otherwise, sometimes your findings start to mix together and merge, and then you're in your discussion and you're discussing something you don't know what RQ it is. So it's real helpful to make subheaders if it's quantitative based on your RQs. Or if it's qualitative based on your themes. Okay, so let's just say for research question 1, you have the subheader, restate or summarize the finding of the research question. If it's a theme, write the theme out, give a brief little setup of what you found. And then here's what they're really looking for in chapter 5 in this section. You want to discuss what you found in relation to previous literature. They say interpretation, but it's not, strictly kind of personal interpretation. It's a discussion of your findings in relation to the findings of previous research. And then you can kind of make interpretations or conclusions based on, how your findings align with previous research. So these findings from previous studies are going to be found in your chapter 2. So for example, for your research question 1, you lay out what you found, you summarize it. Then you want to bring in some of the major findings in that area for that research question from your chapter 2. And you want to note whether your findings support those previous findings, or they don't support, or they add something new. If your findings support previous research, then you can make a pretty strong conclusion based on that. If so, that means previous researchers found something and your research corroborated it. Then whatever it is that you're looking at, you can make a conclusion about that, a pretty strong conclusion. If your findings don't support previous research, I mean, sometimes people get crestfallen and it's like, oh my gosh, it's fine. The research, your findings are what they are. And we're supposed to have an objective approach as researchers. Even if your findings don't support previous research, that's fine. It still tells us something, right? It still tells us that, things in this area are still inconclusive, right? Because if your findings don't support previous findings, it suggests a degree of inconclusiveness. So you want to note that, right? And if your findings don't agree with previous research, it's usually expected that you try to explain why your findings might be different. Okay, it might have to do with maybe the specific population that you studied. It might be due to a limitation in your study, but some kind of explanation of why your findings might be different in that area. Obviously, if your findings are novel or they show something new, which happens more often in qualitative studies, but it can also happen in quant studies, you definitely want to note that as well. Okay, that's the kind of general idea. So you take it for research question 1 or theme 1, and then you just do the same thing for the next research question or the next theme, and you just move through until you're done. And again, it's a way to it helps your reader because obviously it chunks information for them, and it's easier for you as a writer because it gives you an organizational strategy, so you're not kind of just awash in your findings and things are kind of getting mixed together. Let's see, where are we? Going backwards. Limitations. Again, check your school's template. Some schools want a separate section for limitations, which is fine. Some schools don't, which is also fine. If your school doesn't have want a separate section for limitations, you just put them at the end of the interpretation of the findings section. But basically what you want to do here is explain any shortcomings or weaknesses of your study that may have affected results. And limitations aren't challenges. So sometimes people will talk about challenges, like it was really difficult to get these questionnaires out or, respond. But in the end, everything worked out. So those aren't really limitations. Those are just challenges. And, there's all kinds of challenges. But if something like really had the potential to affect your results, and a big limitation potentially in quantitative studies, for example, is a low sample size, because that decreases your statistical certainty. So anything like that in qualitative, sometimes you can't get the population you wanted to study, so you have to use kind of a proxy that could affect your results. For qualitative studies, sometimes researcher bias is a potential limitation because you're just too close to it. And there's ways to mitigate research and prevent researcher bias. But these are the things you want to note and discuss. It's not a long section, but it's more of just kind of being forthright about the limitations. In other words, there's certain things that may have affected your results. So the readers need to kind of interpret your results or look at your results with those limitations in mind. Sometimes in chapters 1 or chapter 3 or both, in the proposal, they may have wanted you to talk about potential limitations. At that point, it would have been forward-looking. It's always helpful to go back to those sections to see what you thought might have been a limitation, and see if those actually turned out to be limitations. Usually, they want you also to discuss the generalizability of your findings to the larger population. If you have a quantitative study and your sample, you had an adequate sample size, it was large enough, chances are your results are going to generalize pretty well. Different sampling strategies may affect that. Random sampling increases generalizability because it's it gives a random sample. It's not based on convenience, like who's easy for you to get access to. For qualitative studies are not designed to generalize. By nature, they have a low sample size, and by nature and by design, because you're looking for in-depth information, in-depth perspectives, and in-depth, rich in-depth details. So you need that low sample size. You can't, for example, interview 70 people, right? So qualitative studies are designed to get that information that quantitative studies can't get with large sample sizes. So it's worth just kind of discussing that there a little bit. If you have a qualitative study that your results won't generalize well, but they're not designed to. That's kind of a trade-off with qualitative studies. They get that in-depth data that quantitative studies can't. Okay, I'll get to that question at the end. Let's see. Whoops, I keep going backwards. All right. There's also should be a section called significance or implications. And this is really usually has two prongs to it. I have implications for practice. But there may also be something called implications or contributions to the research or theoretical implications. So we conduct studies for a reason, right? We get this information, we get this data, and it's like, okay, big deal. This is kind of goes back to the significance section of your chapter 1. How is this information going to be valuable, and who's it going to be valuable to? So one of the ways it's valuable is for practice, right? So they want you to discuss some of the implications or significance to practice. And that's just kind of like it sounds. Based on what you found, how can your information relate to what people do at the level of practice in your area, that would in your discipline or your area? So if it's an education study, how might the information you got help teachers, help what they do in the classroom? And maybe it's valuable to administrators. And you can kind of get nuts and bolts here. You can get precise, like the more specific, the better. If your study shows that, yes, professional development isn't really important for teachers, well, then the practical implications are, have more professional development. Well, how can we do that? Well, through, professional development seminars, through training, maybe, increased focus at the level of education, educating teachers. So any kind of ways you can get really kind of specific and nuts and bolts about how you're finding can inform practice is good. And remember, it's not general implications for practice. It's based on what you found. And the other kind of prong to this is implications for or significance to research. So in other words, how might your findings contribute to the research, or contribute to the understanding of the theory, if you want to talk about the theory. So in other words, as researchers, do they need to focus on something else? If your findings show something specific about the topic, does it mean approaches need to change? Does it mean that certain things need to be focused on before other aspects? So how might the findings contribute to the research? And then there's also, this is closely linked, but it's a little different, recommendations for further research. So based on what you found, what do you recommend that researchers look at in the future, right? So if let's see, what you found kind of is inconclusive, like say your findings don't support previous research, that suggests inconclusiveness. So you can generally just kind of recommend more research in the area because there's a degree, things are still inconclusive. Any kind of new or novel finding definitely would warrant further research, right? Because if it's something that hasn't been explored yet or examined yet, we need more research on it. You can also recommend different kinds of research. So if you conducted a quantitative study and it kind of suggested that we're seeing the tip of the iceberg or something, you can recommend more qualitative research on it to kind of help explain it more, to get that in-depth kind of understanding about it. You can recommend case studies. A case study is it's in one specific setting, but it has multiple data sources, right? It might involve interviews and a quantitative component and observations or something, or looking at records. So a case study would give us a more comprehensive view of the topic. So the point is, you can also recommend different kinds of studies to get different kinds of information. Recommendations can also be based on limitations. So for example, if you did conduct that quantitative study and you did have a low sample size, you could recommend researchers replicate your study, but address that limitation. Okay, and check your school's template, because some schools let you end at the recommendation for further research. Some schools want a summary or a conclusion. fine. It's just, it's a little bit different of a conclusion than the other chapters, because not only is it a summary of the chapter, it's a summary of your entire dissertation. So like other summaries, just recap major points from the chapter. But also, since it is the end of the, your conclusion to the dissertation, you want to leave the reader with a nice take-home message, right? Sell the importance of what you found, and leave the reader with the kind of most important things about your study, your findings that you want them to remember. Don't bring in any new information. Summaries usually aren't that long, or conclusions, a couple paragraphs maybe, make them nice and tight and focused. Again, sell your findings. They're valuable in some way. You just have to kind of learn how to, push that a little bit. Okay, and this is who we are and our contact information. So, if you want to look around the website, if you want to, make an appointment to talk to somebody about what we offer, that's fine. It's free, no obligation. But that's that's what we do. We provide consulting, editing, guidance, basically through any chapter or all chapters, whatever you need. All right. Oops, I'll leave that up. And I do have one question here. And if you do have questions, just again, type them into the chat box or type them into the question and answer box. But here's a question that says, can you give an example of research or bias? Just, I don't know. Maybe if you're studying, I don't know. It's more of an idea of being like really kind of close to the subject and maybe being emotionally tied to it. Maybe if you're a teacher and you're studying teaching issues and this something is really kind of dear to you, right? That's fine, but sometimes people get really, they're really impassioned about it, and there's nothing wrong with passion, absolutely not. But it's more of, learning how to kind of divorce yourself from your emotions to the extent that you can be objective. So I hope it's not really an example, but I hope I'm explaining it well. And there's ways to, if you look it up, there's ways to kind of prevent or mitigate researcher bias. Sometimes it involves, keeping notes of your preconceived notions of something, to become aware of them so you can avoid them. So it's things like that. It's really just being kind of like maybe caring too much or being too kind of, emotionally invested in the topic. And again, that's not bad. Passion isn't bad for something. It's just, it can prevent objectivity if you kind of, let it rule you instead of kind of pulling back on that, so you can be a little more objective. Okay, let's see. I am writing a manuscript-based dissertation. The results chapters are journal articles. I struggle to avoid repetition between the limitations section of the articles and the limitations section in the discussion chapter. Is there a way to make this section of discussion more distinct? I'm not really getting that, what you're asking. The results chapters are journal articles. I struggle to avoid repetition between the limitations. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not, if you can kind of refocus that for me, I'm not getting that really. Maybe I'm not getting kind of what kind of study it is. Let's see. Here's another question. What kind of limitations would be found in qualitative studies besides unable to generalize to other populations? I don't know. Sometimes the limitations are very specific to like what you're doing, your topic or your situation. Like, with COVID now, there's restrictions. That could definitely, for a qualitative study, if you had plans on doing face-to-face interviews, obviously you can do Zoom interviews or anything like that. And I would think they're fine. But sometimes that face-to-face, the nature of the face-to-face communication and the being able to read body language and things can be, construed as a limitation. For some limitations are just standard to, either qual or quant. Again, you can't, you had participants lined up and something happened, their organization says, no, they can't, they can't participate. So anything like that, and you'd have to get like another population at the last minute or something, things like that. But I think interviewing, is specific to qualitative, that, there's limitations or there's things that can crop up with, interviewing, especially again, like I said, with COVID and distancing and not being able to meet face to face. Okay. Let's see. Does that admitting bias lessen the results? No, admitting bias doesn't lessen the results. It's not so much as admitting bias, like, oh my God, I was biased. It's like, because how can you tell? It's more of, bias is a concern in qualitative research. And so to help prevent bias, I use this strategy to help prevent it. So it's more of that. It's not like kind of admitting to it. It's more of, it could have been a problem, and I took these steps to mitigate it. And it doesn't lessen your results at all. I mean, the limitations, it's really just kind of being, forthright about things that may have affected your results. Okay. Re-bias, about bias. My program requires a positionality statement in chapter 3, which states the researcher's position vis-a-vis the RQs and subjects. Why are you interested? What commonalities do you share? And efforts made to minimize bias or effect on findings. Okay, yeah, and sometimes schools do require that, the researcher's position or positionality statement. Yeah, that's a good point. Where you do you are transparent about your relationship to the professional relationship or whatever it is to the participants, and your kind of connection to the study or the topic. Yeah, that's a good point. Please repeat what to include in the introduction part of the discussion chapter. The introduction, okay. Yeah, pretty simple. It's really just to kind of reorient your reader, remind the reader what you're doing, restate the purpose of your study, remind the reader of the importance and the need for your study or the research problem, preview the contents of the chapter. And I had a couple like little notes to that, which one was, sometimes you can, if the school wants you to, you briefly summarize your findings at the end of that section. The other kind of note to that was, some schools want, in the introduction, they want you to give a summary of the previous chapters, which is not typical, but I know there's a school out there that wants you to do that. So that's the general kind of approach right there to the introduction. Again, follow your school's templates if they have special requirements. Okay. Okay, I'm back to the person who asked about the limitations in chapters 4 and 5. Let's see, it's a mixed method study. The dissertation isn't a monograph. Instead, the results chapter has 3 articles. Since each article has a limitation section, the limitation section of the thesis discussion is sort of repetitive. I'm wondering if there's a way to avoid repetition in a thesis structured this way. I don't know. I don't see how. I mean, it seems like if the actual limitations of studies represent your limitations, if I'm reading that correctly, then yeah, I don't I think they would just align, and maybe you could just discuss them in different terms, but really say the same thing, unless they're looking for actual limitations of your study, and the articles happen to have their own limitations, which it seems like it would be two different things. So yeah, but the repetition, I don't know if they're actually in alignment and they say the same things. I think there was going to be some degree of repetition, if I'm reading that right. Okay, let's see. Okay, here's a long question, so bear with me here. For my qual study, limitations will include self-selection bias on who was willing to participate in the interview among larger pool invited, those who did not have jobs. Preventing participation in an interview, and this aspect of those not able to participate might inform how they would have responded to the RQs, which could be important data to inform the themes. Limitations could also be linked to demographic data if you have over underrepresentations of certain group identities. Okay, all right, that's just a note to everybody. Okay, good, all right, awesome, thank you. Okay. I am doing a quantitative study. The results from my RQs were mostly not significant. Only 2 RQs were significant. If same size played a role for the non-significant ones, how could I have gotten a significant result for the 2 RQs? Well, size, size is important. Sample size is important, but it doesn't necessarily influence like whether something is significant or not. Those are the results. I mean, that's what it's based on, the results of your surveys, based on the responses of your participants. I mean, it is what it is. So I don't know if sample size would explain the difference. So yeah, so that's, I mean, those are your results. I mean, I guess it tells you something. It tells you that in this population, these things that you looked at that were significant, and the other things weren't. Okay, correction. If sample size influenced the insignificant results, how could I have gotten a significant? Oh yeah, I just answered that. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be based on sample size. It's probably just based on what your participants responded. Okay, yeah, this is an example of limitations of what I read earlier. Yep, thank you for that. Okay, good. Did I get them all? Did I get everybody's questions? I think so. Okay, great. Anything else before I let you go? All right, great. Well, thank you for attending, and good luck. I think, use your resources, like webinars, Google Scholar, use your school's library, use the internet, and, work closely with your chairs. And persevere. It's a big hill, and it takes some blood, sweat, and tears sometimes. Okay, thank you, everybody. All right, take care. Bye-bye.